Now, just over a year ago, delegations from across the African continent gathered in South Africa to meet with Chinese leadership at the 2015 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, where President Xi Jinping pledged $60 billion in development aid to Africa. And while the last year has been eventful on both African and global fronts, at least China has stuck to their word, seeing a 515% increase of Chinese capital investment into Africa, up from full year 2015 figures. So as 2016 draws to a close, what more has been done to promote win-win cooperation between nations? And what can we look forward to with regards to China-Africa relations in 2017? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, strategic collaboration with Africa has become a priority in the global north, east and west, and China in particular has rapidly increased its ties to the continent in recent years. And it seems that Africans have taken notice. A recent Afrobarometer survey reported that on average, 63% of Africans surveyed believed China to be a somewhat or very positive influence in their countries.
The main reason what actually triggered us to undertake this survey was, I just want to highlight one important aspect, that the survey didn't just look on the issues on external, the effect of Africa's external influence, which is, as we're saying, China and the United States of America, but it was a broader survey. You know, as Afrobarometer, we do a survey that look into a number of issues, democracy and governance. So these issues that we're presenting now were part of the broader aspects of democracy and governance. So we ask a lot of questions on trust, we ask issues on the economy, on corruption, citizenship, ethnicity, and governance performance, and a wide range of issues as Afrobarometer, but as well because we survey on a number of topical issues that are happening in Africa. So we also realized we needed to assess citizen perception in terms of what are their views on Africa's external actors. So for us, I think what's important, especially when you're talking of a poll, is the methodology itself. We focus on stringent measures in terms of our methodology. For instance, we come up with a symbol, and that symbol should be a true reflection of the demographic of that particular population. So in any other country that we are in, that Afrobarometer has a presence, we use the same methodology, but the symbol is a reflection of the total population. So in terms of selection, how do we select these countries? We know we have 54 countries in Africa, but how do we select the 12 countries? How have we moved to 36 countries? There are certain criteria that we actually go by. I want to highlight three aspects. For instance, the very first thing I've actually also highlighted that in all the countries that we filled surveys, there should be an updated census. That country should have a census that is not older than 10 years because our symbol should align to the population dynamics. So in countries where they don't do census, maybe countries at war, and they can't have updated population figures, it's actually a no-go area for us because then we have difficulty in come up with a representative symbol. We ask citizens whether to rate the quality of assistance that they have received from external actors like from China. I think generally it points to the aspect that citizens are actually appreciative, or they acknowledge the helpfulness of the assistance that they've received from these external actors.
Role players within China.
In terms of policy, I think our survey actually is of great value because for any countries they want to engage into any strategic partnership with China, it's important for them to know what the citizens are saying. So I think what our findings actually shows that citizens are not happy with certain aspects. So if governments in these respective countries are actually engaging in any strategic partnership with China, these are some of the issues that they can raise. So I think there is need to have some discussion in terms of how they can incorporate the locals for any business or any strategic partnership. So this is really important for government in terms of agreements for any treaty, future treaty with China.
With me now is Professor Li Xiaoyun of the Chinese Agricultural University. Professor, thank you for joining us on Talk Africa. Now, China's influence in Africa, in investment, in trade, in culture has grown over the last 10 years. Give us a brief of your assessment of China's involvement in Africa.
And China is not a newcomer in Africa. And China has actually been developing a very close relation since 1960s. And over time, the relation between China and Africa has been changing. And the relationship in 1960s, 1970s was really focused on the issue of political solidarity. And start from 1980s, and the relationship between China and Africa actually gradually shifted to more mutual benefit economic relations. But today, and the relation between China and Africa has comprehensive. It's no longer in any single aspect. It's really comprehensive area. Yeah.
What are the new thoughts, though, on China's new thoughts on its cooperation with Africa? Because you're saying now it is very comprehensive, no longer just limited to political. What are the new thought directions in China?
I think that China will use Africa very strategically and not in the short view, because China considers Africa is the continent which has a great potential and great future, because Africa is the youngest continent in the world. And the African will, and according to the population growth rate, and African will become the largest population in the world. And at the same time, you see the African has a largest number of the labor force in the world in the future. So China consider, of course, China, African is increasing amount of middle class, number of middle class people in the continent. China considers this is the opportunity, and China considers it the opportunity that to build this kind of mutual benefit based relationship. So that's something which China, the reason why behind what China has been putting a lot of investment, a lot of emphasis with African relations. Yes.
Well, China has been putting a lot of investment, and in Africa particularly, China is the biggest investor in Africa's infrastructure, the biggest builder of Africa's infrastructure here. What are your thoughts, though, on China's and Africa's relationships moving forward? Where are we going to see China investing in?
You know that the issue here is that now some people actually argue to say, look, and many countries, developed countries in 1960s, 1970s, even 1980s, and even 1990s invested a lot in African infrastructure. And this infrastructure investment can be actually traced back during the colonial time. If you look for the Kenya, if for the East African, very clearly. So the issue here, argument is that, and what is new for China's investment in infrastructure in Africa? And I said, well, this is very different, because if you see today, and African is capture the new opportunity. So Africa, if you look for the African's economic growth record over the last 10 years, so African is not left behind. African is carrying out very progressively. So today, and African, and in the future, African will be a very fast-growing area in the world. So in that aspect, the infrastructure investment will be the very important foundation and vehicle even for the growth in Africa, and also for China, because if you look for the Chinese economy and for the China's development record, we need a strong linkage with Africa. We need a strong linkage because China has a surplus for capital, and China has surplus for production capacity, and all this surplus, you see the exchange of this, production capacity, exchange of capital. This will give the return for China in the future. This will give the new driving force, African development.
We've seen a lot of bilateral assistance between African governments and the Chinese government, but we're also seeing a lot of investment from private business here. What is the difference, though, between Chinese aid and Chinese investment?
Yeah, very often, the medium and the public confused for the aid, for the investment, and the state state-owned companies' investment and private investment, they all categorize into our so-called Chinese investment, or Chinese for aid, or Chinese support, in general Chinese support. But indeed, and today, and the involvement with African, China's involvement with African has become very diversified, and in the sense of you see an increasing number of private investors coming to African, and also a very strong presence of state-owned capital. If you look for different companies, and also we can also see increasing significant presence of Chinese development corporation. And if you look for the building of AU buildings, and if you see the collaboration between China and Kenya, and China and Tanzania with other countries, as well, in the China African agricultural technology demonstration centers in 24 countries. So those areas, you see a very diversified Chinese involvement. China's involvement with African now is very diversified, and this really fitted the situation, new situation, what African actually need. African need investment. African need private sectors, involvement, and all those things will provide opportunity for African and also for China, for China's development as well as for African development. Yeah.
But you do focus a lot in your work on poverty reduction, on areas of agriculture, on many socio economic issues, and right now, many Africans feel like China's development model has a lot to offer the African situation. What are your thoughts on China's development model, and what exactly do you think Africa can borrow from China's development model?
I would not like to use the China's development model, but I would like to use experiences and lessons from China. And that, the number of key features I like to highlight here, because the number one is that how the state and how the government is committed and to help and support and lead the people and the society to move ahead. So that is very important. I think from that point of view, and that gives the reference to the African to keep a kind of a consistent and stable political structure, and which this political structure can provide a very good political environment and for the public and for the society. So that's one. And the second one is that China has actually developed its own agriculture, but use this agriculture to be as the base for further industrialization. So this is very important for African. If you look for most sub-Saharan African countries, so over 90% of people live in the rural area, and there are major occupations, agriculture and farming. So that without developed agriculture, will be very difficult for African country to move into an industrialized, even middle-income countries. So that is the second area where I'd really like to address. And thirdly, to develop a kind of a labor-intensive sector for primary industry sectors, to move from the labor industry into high tech and in other areas. So those are the areas where we're looking for, even for the urbanization, and for China's urbanization, rapid urbanization actually attracted agriculture development, and industrialization and urbanization. Actually, these three areas have helped China completely transform itself. So those areas where African might have to look at the experience lessons from China. I would not see African can copy and just take simply, but African could look at it as the reference.
So as a final thought, Professor, though, China and Africa now know where the relationship is and where the relationship is going. In your view, how can Africa leverage its relationship or the knowledge that it has about China to further enhance its own economic development? And how can China leverage its relationship with Africa in a bid to enhance its influence on the continent?
And from Chinese perspective, I would say, and as I mentioned earlier, that it's huge opportunity coming and already exists and are coming. And it is war up to African to take this opportunity well, and to capture this opportunity and to utilize this opportunity for development requires, from my perspective, number of conditions. First, as I always emphasize, that political stability, political social stability is very important, and also consistent political system would keep us development strategy consistently in the long run is essentially important. Otherwise, you have different way. You have always changed different strategies. You miss the opportunity. So that is one. And secondly, it is a time for African to look at the different paradigm and a different framework, which very much based on kind of infrastructure-based, development-oriented, governance. It's rather than differently, different from previous paradigm being actually used widely, and also lastly, and this requires different kind of skills, different kind of relationship to view whatever China and African on India and African with other countries. So we have to really change. We have to really change our mindset that African must doing this, African must doing that. But it's the mutual, really based on the mutuality and how and China would see its own its interest here. And what I said clearly, and China regard Africa as a strategic partnership, because China consider Africa is the potential important market, and China consider Africa is the potential area where in the future China would have a strong economic interest here. Therefore, this relationship will not based on kind of one way of interest, but very much mutual benefit and mutual learning. This is something which I would say we expect China and Africa could develop in the future fruitful relationship. Yes.
Professor Li, thank you very much for your
welcome.
insights. And that was Professor Li Xiaoyun of the Chinese Agriculture University. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue this discussion on the state of China-Africa relations in 2016. To stay with us.
Here is a man representing a country which never was our colonizer. He is doing to us what we expected those who colonized us yesterday to do.
It's about moving the African agenda forward together with the Chinese in a win-win situation.
I think this is now elevating the partnership that China has with Africa to another level.
We are saying to China, thank you very much for China's understanding of Africa's difficulties and challenges, as it has always done. We are thankful that the Chinese leadership and the people of China are prepared to be with us, to pull with us under these kind of circumstances.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to offer further analysis into the state of China-Africa relations in 2016, I have expert guests standing by in Nairobi, consultant economist David Owiro, and also in studio with me here in Nairobi is current affairs commentator Professor Macharia Munene. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. Professor Macharia, I'll start off with you here. Now, China's influence in Africa, whether political or economic or cultural, has grown over the last decade or so. Give us a view of what you think China's view was in Africa in 2016.
Well, previously there was very little knowledge on the part of Africa about China. That has changed. More and more Africans are taking interest in China, are interacting with China, and they are cutting deals, making arrangements that are both economic and political. So the relationship has been cemented, increased in the last few years from the position of mutual understanding. It is not that one is overreaching the other, they are reaching out to each other in that regard. So that has been the perspective from the African side. From the Chinese side, I think they have also been looking into, as they diversify their interactions with other players in the world, how is it best to promote the Chinese interest? And the promotion of Chinese interest is to interact with almost every part of the globe, with Africa being a major component of that part.
Let's hear the economic aspect of it. David, from your economic perspective, what did we see in terms of China's involvement in Africa in 2016?
I think we've seen a general strengthening of the cooperative relationship between Africa and China. This, of course, has bloomed into, major support that the Chinese have given to Africa through the China-Africa forums that they hold. And 2016 is interesting because a lot of investment, especially in terms of the infrastructure developments, have been done in Africa through support from China. And so just in terms of laying down or supporting core infrastructure support that is necessary for a trade boom in Africa, China has played a critical role. And of course, on the African part, they view China as a nation which is ready to offer very critical support, and that support doesn't come with conditionalities in that regard, which is something that has bedeviled a lot of traditional Western support that African nations have gotten.
Right, Professor Macharia, from your perspective, though, did we see any new strategies and initiatives by China in 2016? Where exactly was the focus, whether political or elsewhere?
It was more on the investment side, the infrastructure, political interaction at the high level. To that extent, China is the stimulant for a lot of attention, extra-continental attention to Africa. Is that good or not? It is good in itself because countries have to interact in more diverse ways than just one way. So there is that increased presence of China, both politically and also economically, in terms of infrastructure development. We always, in Kenya, we talk about the LAPSET as a big one. But we know the LAPSET is beyond Kenya. It's a real continental thing, part of the One Belt, One Road strategy, global strategy, that aims at linking up every part in terms of communication, which in turn reduces the cost of operations and stimulates economies. So that has been seen to increase in different ways. On the area of security, we've seen China increasingly taking an interest in being involved in finding possible solutions to some of the challenges facing the security challenges that face the continent at present. That has become very evident in the process. Therefore, it is noticeable.
Right. David, in terms of strategies and perception and Chinese activities, what stood out for you in 2016?
I think the thing that most stood out for me was, the critical support that China offered in terms of pledges and also in terms of commitments to the African Union towards strengthening the, various peace missions, that were required in various parts of Africa, but also to strengthen in terms of, as has already been mentioned, the security operations that are going on in Africa. I think for me those stood out, and those are the ones that actually change lots of perceptions in terms of how people view China vis-a-vis, what has been there in the past.
Professor Macharia, on the front of security, in terms of peacekeeping as well, China has been quite active on the continent.
Yes. It appears like a new engagement, in part because China has also made it loud that it will be involved. Sometimes it likes talking about being a responsible state or nation playing the international arena. This in itself, we know that China is involved in South Sudan. We know that it is involved in other places, or through the United Nations as a way of keeping the peace where it is needed.
Right. David, I want to draw your attention to the Afrobarometer survey recently conducted, which showed that at least 63% of Africans now say that China's influence is somewhat or very positive on the continent. In which areas, though, do you think China is having the most influence? And what do you think has led the African population, 63% is quite a high number, to give this feedback?
Yeah. Yeah, certainly, and you know, you can tell because of the character of Chinese cooperation. As was mentioned earlier, the Chinese provide critical support for, you know, infrastructure projects that you know, basically go towards addressing the inadequate infrastructure challenge that we have across Africa. Now, these are things that people are able to see on the ground, and so, you know, it's not surprising for you to have such a high number with very you know, positive sentiment about Chinese investments in Africa. If you contrast that with, you know, the other models of development that Africa has been part of, you know, the West has traditionally supported you know, governance reforms, and, you know, things of governance reforms, and given the challenges that we have you know, in our setup, you know, those are things that people can't really see, you know, the results of. And so, you know, it makes sense to, you know, for such a high approval rating in terms of, you know, the perception of Chinese development in Africa. At the same time, you know, it's an interesting place for, I think, the African nations to be in, because one of the things that has been lacking is that traditional development support from the West has not often gone towards, you know, supporting the critical, you know, hardcore, you know, so to speak, development needs, such as, you know, infrastructure development. And so Chinese support here is seen as being very, very critical.
Right. Professor Macharia, though, President Xi Jinping visited Egypt for the very first time early this year. Any impact on China-Africa relations from there?
The interest shown in Egypt, mainly because of its strategic location, linking Asia with Africa, the Mediterranean, and being also one of the points where the One Belt, One Road strategy is passing through there, linking up Europe with Africa, down to Mombasa and then across that thing. It was a message being sent to Egypt and to the rest of Africa that this is a serious, the infrastructure building up is a serious undertaking. It will not go down or go backward. It is a way of going forward. And the purpose of this is to open up the various countries to both China and to themselves so that they can link up in a major way. Let me add a little bit something about why Africans are positive, more positive about China than before. The way China has appeared to deal with various African situations. It's projected as a way of respect as opposed to insult. You have, in contrast, and people, because Africans can see through these things, they want somebody who respects them, not somebody who insults them. And that in itself is reflected by this positive attribution to the Chinese activities.
All right, we'll leave it there for the moment. And that's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa. But thank you to my guests for their insights. In Nairobi, consultant economist David Owiro, and also with me in studio, academic and current affairs commentator Professor Macharia Munene. Thank you very much for being with us on the program. Remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more on Talk Africa. Goodbye.